Hello, photojournalism students. Welcome to the first of our video lectures that we are going to be doing over Zoom. I'm going to be pre-recording them and posting them to Folio. The first lecture that I recorded is already posted. It just explained how the class is changing because of COVID-19, which is a good reminder to wash your hands. Okay, so today what we are going to be talking about is the idea of photographers' rights. This is namely going to be a conversation about where photographers are allowed to be and where they are allowed to put themselves in order to take pictures and what they are allowed to take pictures of. This is a particularly important thing for photographers because, one, photographers are often sent out into the world without proper knowledge of their rights. And so a lot of misconceptions form that we will talk about. Also, the legal ramifications of this stuff end up being pretty big sometimes. Also, the laws change based on where you live. So just so you know, I'm going to be talking about this from the standpoint of Georgia as well as the standpoint of the United States, but it's not the same everywhere. Each state is going to have certain different aspects of the law, as well as different countries will absolutely have different aspects of the law. And just so you know, there are some apps out there that are pretty useful to have if you're going to be going out into the world doing photojournalism. The one that is sort of the top pick for Apple phones, at least for iPhones, is Photographers' Rights is the name of the app. And you can actually set it to where you live, and it'll tell you where what all of the photography laws are in that place. This can be useful for if you travel, you can change the location setting on it. But also it will translate into different languages if you travel. And also it brings up quick code, the legal laws in certain areas. So if you are hassled about something, you'll have the law ready to go to show somebody. That'll make more sense what I'm saying here in a second. The reason why we're talking about this is because more so than just about any other form of journalism, photojournalists are the ones who get hassled the most. They're the ones who get harassed by police, they're the ones that get arrested the most, they're the ones that get pushed around the most, and they're the ones who have their civil rights violated the most. And I don't entirely know why that is. It may just be that photographers, because they have a camera in their hand, visually are easier targets than people who just carry around a notepad. I don't know exactly why, but photographers get pushed around a lot. So it's important that we know our rights. An important thing to keep in mind is that the people who are going to try to violate your rights as a photographer oftentimes are not going to know that they are doing it. They're not well versed in the law. Most of the time, the people who you're going to be hassled by are low-paid security guards, shift workers, bar bouncers, people who have not taken the time to study the case law that has led to how the First Amendment of the United States Constitution has been enforced over the years. And that's not really their fault. Like, it sucks that they're hassling you if you're a photographer, but ultimately, just keep in mind that you're in a position in your life to go to college and to study this stuff and know it. Not everybody's in that same position you are. And also, just a good personal lesson, I think, is that if you are a photographer, photojournalist, you're out in the world, you're taking pictures of people, and someone starts being a jerk to you, it almost never ends up being worth it to be a jerk back to them. It almost always just escalates the situation. I have almost always found that, like, if someone starts shouting at you that you have to leave or that you can't take pictures here, or I need to if someone says you need to show me your camera, you need to delete those pictures, someone's like shouting at you and is really going at you, like, shouting back or getting in their face will almost always 100% of the time make the situation worse. To me, it's like those old, like, finger traps you used to win at the circus or like win at an arcade. You stick your fingers in both sides of them, and if you try to pull your fingers apart, if you struggle against it, it just makes the whole thing worse. It's kind of like that. I will talk you through how to handle situations with this lecture, but the number one golden rule is if people are hassling you or shouting at you or whatever, stay calm, don't shout back. That'll just make the problem worse. And it's important to remember, in any tense situation, the best weapon you have is the ability to stay calm, to be polite, to have a level tone of conversation, and to explain what it is you're taking pictures of and why you are taking pictures. You can offer them information about the rights of photographers. You can ask them to point out which law that they are using to justify stopping you from taking pictures. This is where having that app in your phone that has a list of the laws in your area can be really useful, because if you were to come across a security guard who's yelling at you about how you can't take pictures, you don't want to have to show them this PowerPoint lecture that I filmed. They probably won't pay attention to it. But if you have a quick thing on your phone that's like, look, this is what the law is, that might be able to help you out a little bit better. And if all else fails, if somebody's getting in your face, if somebody is pushing you, if somebody is at all giving you a hard time, use your smartphone to video record them doing that. Get out a pen and paper and ask for their name, ask for their supervisor's name, ask why they're trying to prevent you from taking photographs. I will caution that if you are dealing with a police officer, be very careful when you pull your smartphone out. You don't want to give them any excuse to think that you are pulling a weapon, because if you are there as a photojournalist taking pictures of them as police, they already don't like you. So overarching lesson here, you got to find your inner zen, you got to calm down, you got to have a little bit of some inner peace as you deal with some of the hassles that are involved in knowing your rights as a photographer. Also, before we get into this thing fully, we need to clarify some very confusing differences that will come into play in this conversation. And that's the difference between something being a public space versus something being public property. Space and property are two different conversations here. A public space is any place in public where you don't need an invitation to be. You don't need permission to be. You can just simply go freely. That is a public space. Public property is about the ownership of the land. So the public property is when the land itself is owned by the government and maintained by taxpayer money. So if it is a public building, if it's owned by the city or the county or the state or the federal government, we call it public property. But not every piece of public property is a public space. Also, there can be private property, which means the property is owned by a particular private entity, but private property can still be a public space. This will make a little bit more sense once we get deeper into this PowerPoint and I explained it a little better, but please do keep in mind the differences between space and property. These are going to be very important points to understanding the rights of photographers. So let's talk about some of the basic commandments of photojournalism rights. Right number one, out in the public means you can shoot just about anything. We usually think about public spaces meaning outside and public, not indoors. We think about it in terms of being a municipal area, but that, remember, is public property, not public space. A public space can include a park, it can include sidewalks, it can include stores, shopping malls, restaurants, etc. A public space is simply any place you don't need an invitation to be. And a shopping mall, for example, you don't need an invitation to go to the shopping mall. You just simply walk into the shopping mall. Now, this, of course, we're assuming is in non-COVID-19 times. I had to go to the pet store today to buy a carrier for my cat, because I have to take the cat to the vet tomorrow. And the people working at Petco were sort of letting customers in one at a time into the store. In that case, maybe laws under COVID-19 are a little different. So we're assuming this is regular times. You don't need written invitation to go to a shopping mall, and therefore a shopping mall is a public space. So a public space, again, and this is important, is a place where an invitation is not reasonably expected in order for you to be there. So the first question that almost always gets asked is like, okay, but wait, what about a grocery store, right? Is a grocery store a public space? Yes, a grocery store, a Walmart, they are public spaces, which means that you have the right to go in and start taking pictures. Now, you may not be able to keep taking pictures because we'll talk about this in a second. But, oh, well, here we go. Despite most businesses being public spaces, so Walmart is a public space, it is private property, which means that the business owners can have their own sets of laws that they can enforce in a certain area, their own rules in the area. So they can tell you, Walmart can tell you, hey, you're not allowed to take pictures here. You can walk in and start taking pictures, but if they find you taking pictures, they're going to tell you, hey, you have to leave, you have to get out of here, you have to go. And then once they do kick you out, then you do need to go, because you can't just say, no, this is a public space, because they can kick you out of a public space. And if you refuse to leave, or if you leave and come back, then it's trespassing, and you, the photographer, are the one breaking the law. So a Walmart, for example, is public space, but it's private property, which means they set the rules, which means that if you walk in with a DSLR and start taking pictures as a photographer, anything that you take a picture of, you're allowed to use. But as soon as Walmart notices you're doing this, they will kick you out. And when they tell you you have to leave, you do have to leave. So let's think about the inverse. If Walmart is a public space but a private property, a public elementary school or a high school or a middle school, those would be the exact opposite, right? Like Statesboro High School is public property because it is owned by the Bullitt County. It is owned by the state of Georgia. It's paid for by taxpayers. But you can't just go to high school without an invitation, right? You can't, as an adult, just walk onto a high school and wander around and take pictures. That would be trespassing. There are explicit rules against that. So even though it is a public-owned place, it is not a public space. It's considered a private space because you have to get permission from the administrators to enter property, enter the high school property if you are not a student there. So that makes Walmart and high schools sort of different from one another in a lot of ways. But from a photography standpoint, it shows you how public spaces are different from public property and private property. At a public meeting, so if you are at a school board meeting or a city council meeting, etc., at a public meeting, if you're getting in the way of the operations of the meeting, they can ask you to sit down, but they can't ask you to leave. That is, unless you keep disrupting the meeting, in which case they can ask you to leave, in which case you need to leave. So rule number 2, when you're on private property, the owner of the property gets to make the rules regarding if pictures are allowed or not. And not just if pictures are allowed, but how they are allowed. So for example, if we were to go up to the Masters, the golf tournament up in Augusta, one of the rules they have is that you have to be credentialed in as a photographer. Of course, lots of sporting events have that. But at the Masters, as well as a lot of other golf tournaments, they actually make all photographers put their cameras in a quiet box. Sometimes it's called a camera muffler. Here's a hard box version of it on the left and a soft pack version of it on the right. And those are soundproof devices. They make it so that when you press the shutter button and the shutter moves, none of that sound that you normally hear escapes. You might not think that it's very loud, and one DSLR is certainly not very loud, but if you're running a PGA golf tournament or you're running the Masters and you have 80 to 100 photographers there, and they're all taking pictures at the exact same time, it does get kind of loud, which is why they mandate this, because they don't want to get in the way of the golfers or interrupt the golfers doing their golfing. A concert venue, for example, might be a private place. It is private property, and so they get to make the rules. They may say, hey, if you're going to be a photographer at a concert venue and you're going to enter our building to take pictures, you can't use any flash because it just disturbs the artists as they are performing. So that's another example outside of golf where the private property owners get to set the rules for photographers. Not complying with the demands of the owners of the property can lead to you getting kicked out. And again, if someone kicks you out, you need to leave because you can be arrested then for trespassing. And it's important to note that if you're breaking any other laws while you are in the process of photography, being a photographer, you're still breaking those laws, right? So even if you are in the right legally to be taking pictures, if a cop stops and frisks you and you have anything you don't want them to find in your pockets, that's going to be bad news. So just be careful. Also, an owner of private property is not allowed to take your camera or make you delete photos. This is a really big deal. If you walk into the Walmart, you start taking pictures inside of the Walmart, and the manager of the Walmart walks up to you and says, hey, you're not allowed to take pictures in here, you need to leave. You know from paying attention to this lecture that your answer is, all right, I will leave now. But if the manager says, hey, let me see your camera, I need to see what pictures you took, you do not give them your camera, you do not let them see your pictures, you keep walking towards the door, you keep your camera to yourself. Under no circumstances do you show your work to anybody who is hassling you, ever. If you are on public property, this is rule number 3, you can take pictures of private property. This is what we call the sidewalk rule. So essentially, if, let's say, you want to take pictures of a local business, but they kick you out, you can stand on the sidewalk or the next closest available public space, and you can use your camera to take pictures of the business that way, because at that point, you are simply pointing your camera towards a private thing, but you're doing it physically while standing in a public space. That is okay. If you're doing this and someone becomes hostile or aggressive with you, please know that you are 100% in the right. If they start, the owner of the public property starts harassing you or starts interfering with you in any way, I would suggest at that point calling the police because you are in the right there. Number 4, some public spaces are allowed to be very private, very, very private. We've already talked about this a little bit in terms of stuff like high schools and middle schools, but it also applies to stuff like power plants, publicly owned power plants, as well as certain military installations like the Pentagon, for example. Now, these places are almost always going to be very clearly marked. So this is a picture of the Nellis Bombing and Gunnery Range. You probably know it better as Area 51. This is a sign up around the area that says no trespassing on this point, photography is prohibited. In which case, again, it's public land technically because it's owned by the government, but they have explicitly stated photography is prohibited, and therefore don't get yourself arrested either trying to storm Area 51 or trying to take pictures of it. However, don't let people pretend to use these vague notions of safety concerns as a reason to kick you out somewhere if the photography that you are taking is not explicitly banned. So photography at airports is not banned, despite what the TSA will tell you and will try to pretend, despite what local police will try to pretend. You are absolutely within your rights to take pictures of security or to take pictures during the security process at an airport. That is your fundamental right as a photographer. Do not let them stop you from doing that. It doesn't help that back after 9/11, the TSA started publishing posters that made photographers look like very evil people, made them look like terrorists. Kind of a bummer that that is the way things went with that. Okay, this has been part 1 of our conversation on your rights as a photographer, and we will wrap everything up with the second version of the, let's do stop share. We will wrap everything up with the second version of this PowerPoint in just a second in part 2. So see you there. Also, wash your hands.